Shalom to everyone who has come to this video. You should not watch this video if you have not already watched part 1, because this video will serve as an extension of part 1. As mentioned in part 1, the practice of a man having multiple wives was deeply rooted within the culture and widely accepted as normal amongst the ancient Hebrews. And the biblical text never has a prohibition against a man having multiple wives. Now, with the exception of a handful of ascetic groups that might have disapproved of a man having multiple wives, or may have even disapproved of marriage altogether, such as the Therapeutae, for example, which today we would call monks, virtually everyone in ancient Israelite culture accepted the fact that a man could have multiple wives and that it was lawful. So in part 1, we proved that socially imposed or prescriptive monogamy is a Greek and Roman institution. Again, go back and watch part 1 for that proof if you haven't already. As it says on the screen here, it says history of anti-bigamy laws. Even before Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, Diocletian and Maximian passed strict anti-polygamy laws in 285 AD that mandated monogamy as the only form of legal marital relationship, as had traditionally been the case in classical Greece and Rome. In 393, the Roman Emperor Theodosius I issued an imperial edict to extend the ban on polygamy to Jewish communities. All right, so again, as has already been made clear in part 1, this is a Greek and a Roman institution. Now, most of you listening to this video already know that the Protestant Reformation took place in the 16th century, where many Roman Catholics protested or rebelled from the Roman Catholic Church, and Martin Luther is credited with being the leader of this movement. And so the Council of Trent, which convened between 1545 and 1563 in Trent, Italy, was a response to the Protestant Reformation. In other words, it symbolized the Catholic Church's efforts to counteract the influences of the Protestant movement during that period. As it says here, Session 24 celebrated the 11th day of November, 1563, being the 8th held under Pope Pius IV. And that's Pope Pius IV, also known as Giovanni Angelo Medici, who presided over the final Council of Trent. Now, when we look at their canons, again, this is the Roman Catholic Church. This is a Roman Catholic Pope. What does it say? Canon 2 says, if anyone shall say that it is lawful for Christians to have many wives at once, and that this is not forbidden by any divine law, let him be accursed. So whose doctrine is this? The Roman Catholic Church's doctrine. As I just explained, the Council of Trent was a response to the Protestant Reformation. And again, who was the man that is credited with being the leader of the Protestant Reformation? That would be Martin Luther. What did Martin Luther think or say about a man having multiple wives? As it says here, it says Martin Luther deplored divorce, only permitting it in the cases of adultery and the Pauline privilege, and taught that polygamy was allowed in Scripture, citing positive examples of it from the biblical patriarchs, As such, in 1521, he granted the approval for a man to take a second wife, and again in 1539 for Philip I Landgrave of Hesse to take a second wife. And this is a quote from Martin Luther. It says, "I, for my part, admit I can raise no objection if a man wishes to take several wives, since Holy Scripture does not forbid this. But I should not like to see this example introduced among Christians." So it's not that Martin Luther was a proponent or an advocate of men having multiple wives. He was just simply honest. He said, the scriptures don't forbid it. That's all he was saying. And so if Martin Luther, the ostensible leader of the Protestant Reformation, understood this, then why don't modern Christians today understand this? Modern so-called Protestants today. And it's because they are continuing in the legacy and in the doctrine of their mother, which is the Roman Catholic Church. In part 1, we thoroughly explained what the biblical definition of adultery is, including the words of Christ about adultery. And we went over the fact that nowhere in the Tanakh, which is from Genesis to the end of the book of Malachi, will you ever see a mention of the physical act of adultery, unless it is referring to a man having sexual relations with another man's wife. So that's the only definition of physical adultery in the Tanakh. The man's marital status does not matter. Again, a man having sexual relations with another man's wife is the only definition of physical adultery that you will ever see between the pages of Genesis and the end of book of Malachi. And again, in part 1, we went over the comments that Christ made about adultery. So whether or not the man is married is irrelevant. He still cannot have sex with another man's wife. And he still can, or it is still permissible for him to take an unmarried single woman as his wife. Whether or not he's married, that's irrelevant. That's completely irrelevant. So according to these scriptures we're about to read here, he would be required by law to take this woman as his wife. And if he already had a wife, then he is required by law to have multiple wives. This is Exodus chapter 22, starting at verse 16. It says, "And if a man entice a maid that is not betrothed," so that means if a man seduces a virgin that is not already married or engaged to be married to another man. The word here that's translated as maid is the Hebrew term Bethula, which denotes a woman who has never had sex. So it says, "He entice the maid that is not betrothed and lie with her, he shall surely endow her to be his wife." That means he had sex with her, so he must pay the dowry, or the Hebrew word mohar, and keep her as his wife. That's the law. There's no stipulation for whether or not he already had a wife. There's no exception made for a man that already had a wife. Whether or not he had a wife is irrelevant. There's no exception for that. He must take this woman as his wife according to the law. And then it goes on to say, if the father refuses, he still has to pay the mohar. And it is very similar to what we read here in Deuteronomy chapter 22, starting at verse 28, that says, if a man find a damsel that is a virgin, which is not betrothed, and lay hold on her and lie with her, and they be found, then the man that lay with her shall give unto the damsel's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he hath humbled her. He may not put her away all his days. So again, there's no stipulation or exception being made here for a man that already had a wife. His marital status is not even mentioned because it's irrelevant. Remember, Hebrew culture is a patriarchal culture, and it's a culture that practiced polygyny, or a man having multiple wives. So it doesn't matter if he already had a wife. He would be mandated, according to this law, if he already had a wife, he's mandated to take this woman as another wife. There was a clergyman in the Church of England named Martin Madon in the 18th century who had begun to see the deterioration of the virtue and the chastity of the women of his time. So he wrote a book called Thora, or a treatise on female ruin and its causes, effects, consequences, prevention, and remedy. Now, for those who don't know, Thora means female destroyer or female destruction. So the premise of his book was that polygyny would help to prevent the sexual and moral decline and the sexual and moral degradation of the female gender that he was witnessing in his time. And of course, we see it on a far grander scale. The following is a quote from his book. He says, "One thing, however, may be worth observing in this place, which is that some of the most vehement opponents of Thora have themselves laid down in their own comments on the Bible the very principle on which the grand argument which runs throughout the book is founded, namely that of the obligation which men are under to marry the woman they seduce." And that's exactly what we just read. We just read that in Exodus chapter 22, verse 16, and in Deuteronomy chapter 22. Continuing on, it says, one says regarding Deuteronomy 22, verse 29, seduction of an unmarried woman was punished with a fine to the father and with an obligation to marry the woman without the power to divorce her. His observation on this is that he who robs a woman of her honor can never make her reparation but by taking her for his wife. Another comment on the same passage saying, happy will it be for that country in which this divine statute is carried into execution. It will save many from ruin, both of body and soul. The author of Thora very explicitly declares that this divine statute includes all men without exception, regardless of whether they are married or not. And that's exactly what I just explained to you here. There is no exception. Here's another quote from his book where he's talking about what people do with the scriptures. It says, raising impediments that are unwarranted by the scriptures and inventing obstacles that oppose the mind of God as revealed in those scriptures. Neglecting obligations that God has established and enforcing obligations that God has revoked. In other words, they make up their own belief system. Things that the Most High established, they neglect that, but they make up their own obligations or their own rules. Continuing on, it says, separating those whom he has joined together and joining together those whom he has set apart, forbidding marriage where he has permitted it and even commanded it, And we just read in Exodus 22, verse 16, and Deuteronomy 22, verse 28 and 29, that it's a commandment that if a man seduces a woman or a virgin and has sex with her, he has to keep her as his wife. There was no exception for whether or not the man already had a woman. So that's a commandment. But again, they reject that and they make up their own rules. But reading on, it says, and permitting marriage where he has forbidden it, disregarding his laws in some instances and rejecting them in others, declaring something as not sinful when God has deemed it so, and declaring it as sinful when God has not deemed it so. Again, they make up their own definition of sin. That's why the modern church will tell you that if a man has a wife and he takes another woman, that's adultery, because they made that up. That's nowhere in the Bible. But then they'll turn around and tell you eating pork is not a sin, because they made that up. When you can clearly go to the law that says don't eat certain foods and read the law verbatim. But they don't care about that. They reject that. But they'll make up their own laws. But reading on, it says, all of this and much more will be demonstrated in the following excerpts from the annals of the Church of Rome. So he understands that this belief system is a Romish belief system. It says, it will then become clear how and to what extent marriage and everything associated with it have been removed from God's authority and placed in the hands of humans. Here's one more quote from his book. It says that the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 through 3 predicts many of the errors that would later emerge in the Christian church due to the seduction of evil spirits seeking to possess the minds of individuals. These spirits would influence some to teach and others to follow their harmful ways. The Spirit explicitly states that some will depart from the faith, referring to the faith once delivered to the saints. As an example, he mentions one particular error, forbidding marriage, in verse 3. This act disannuls the order established by God and nature, exposing humanity to the temptations and harms of unchastity. And the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3 does mention that people would be forbidding marriage. And he's talking about lawful marriage. And that's what you see today with people saying that it's unlawful for a man to have multiple wives. Because you have to remember that the Most High gave a commandment in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, for mankind to be fruitful and to multiply. He never gave a commandment that men may not have more than one wife. Because you have people who will go to Paul's letters and say that according to some isolated verses in his letters, it's better for a man to stay single or to be a eunuch or to not get married. Some people will say that. However, that was never a commandment given by the Most High. In fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 7, where he says that he wished that all men could be as himself, but everyone has their proper gift of God, one after this manner and another after that, where he's talking about staying single and staying celibate. The verse before that, he told you that I speak this of permission and not of commandment. So there was no commandment that men should not get married, should not take wives, should not be fruitful and multiply. That was the Apostle Paul saying his own opinion. And he himself said that. He never said that that was a commandment. So you have people who are forbidding people to marry lawfully. In part one, we went over where does forced or socially imposed monogamy come from. We covered what is the purpose of having multiple wives. We showed that polygyny was not sin. We went over to become one flesh. We defined lust according to the scriptures. We talked about what Paul said, if anything, about multiple wives. And we went over whether or not polygyny was being practiced during New Testament times. This video is part 2, where we will talk about whether or not Jacob and Abraham were tricked into having multiple wives. We're going to cover the bloodline of Cain argument, where people say that polygyny started with Lamech, therefore it is sinful. We're going to talk about the Esau argument. We're going to go over the belief that polygyny causes problems, and we're going to talk about the Levirate law, and that's what I'm calling in this video the polygyny commandment, because in certain cases it is commanded for a man to have multiple wives in order to exercise the Levirate law. We're going to talk about David taking Saul's wives. We're going to talk about Deuteronomy chapter 17, where it speaks about a king not multiplying wives. And at the end of the video, there will be some notes on leaving an inheritance in the case that a man has multiple wives, because there are those who will erroneously state that having multiple wives somehow negates a man from being able to leave an inheritance to his wives and to his family. So we're going to discuss that as well. So for those who believe and teach that a man having multiple wives is sin, what they are saying is that the Most High couldn't figure out anything better than to have his chosen people be conceived in fornication. Why is that? Because that's how the 12 tribes of Israel were conceived, through polygynous marriage. As it says here in Genesis 39, verse 7 through 9, we're going to see that Joseph, and this is way before Moses' law was given to the children of Israel, he knew that it was a sin to have sex with another man's wife. Verse 7 says, "And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, Lie with me. But he refused and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So again, Joseph knew that it was a sin to have sex with Potiphar's wife, which is why he did not do it. So then why didn't Jacob refuse to take multiple wives if it's supposed to be a sin? And we know that Joseph was a man of the Most High. We know that Jacob was a man of the Most High. Jacob is the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. And again, nowhere did the Most High ever correct him or send a prophet to tell him that what you're doing is wrong. Stop doing this sin. Not only did the Most High not tell Jacob to stop having multiple wives, he never told anybody in the Bible not to have multiple wives. Here it is in Genesis chapter 29, starting at verse 20. It says, "And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days, for the love he had to her. And Jacob said unto Laban, Give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go in unto her. And Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. And it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah his daughter and brought her to him, and he went in unto her. And Laban gave unto his daughter Leah Zilpah his maid for an handmaid. And it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, what is this thou hast done unto me? Did not I serve with thee for Rachel? Wherefore then hast thou beguiled me? So as we know, Laban tricked Jacob and sent Leah in the room to consummate the marriage, which is to have sex with Jacob instead of Rachel. And originally, Jacob wanted Rachel. Verse 26 says, and Laban said, it must not be done so in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Fulfill her week, and we will give thee this also for the service which thou shalt serve with me yet 7 other years. And Jacob did so and fulfilled her week, and he gave him Rachel his daughter to wife also. Again, people will say, well, Jacob took multiple wives because he was tricked. He was tricked into taking multiple wives. However, the truth is that Jacob was not forced to take multiple wives. He worked the whole 7 years to take Rachel as his wife after he was tricked. He wasn't forced to take multiple wives or to commit fornication. For those who believe that it was a sin, he wasn't forced to do that. Not only that, but Jacob also had sex with the maids of Rachel and Leah. He also had children with their maids. Was he forced to do that? Was he tricked into doing that? You see, these are people who are reading at a surface level and don't understand what they're reading. This is verse 1. It says, and when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said unto Jacob, give me children, or else I die. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? And she said, behold, my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. And she gave him Bilhah her handmaid to wife, and Jacob went in unto her. So Jacob had sex with Bilhah in order to reproduce, which is a part of the purpose of having multiple wives. He had sex with Bilhah. Was he tricked into doing that? Nowhere did he ever come to his senses and say, I need to stop committing fornication. Nowhere did the Most High step in and have him corrected or castigated for this. Verse 5 says, and Bilhah conceived and bare Jacob a son. And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore called she his name Dan. And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again and bare Jacob a second son. So Jacob keeps having sex with her. He's having more children with this other maid. He's never coming to his senses. He's never being corrected by the Most High. It's never being called a sin. He's making this conscious decision to have sex with Rachel's handmaid here. He already had sex with Leah. He already had sex with Rachel. Now he's having sex with Rachel's handmaid as well. Verse 8 says, and Rachel said, with great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had left bearing, she took Zilpah her maid and gave her Jacob to wife. So now Leah also is giving her maid to Jacob to wife. Verse 10 says, and Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a son. So Jacob's having sex with Leah's maid as well. So that's 4 wives. Nowhere is it being called a sin. So for those who say he was tricked, was he tricked into having all of this sex with all of these women repeatedly? That doesn't make any sense. This is verse 11. It says, and Leah said, a troop cometh, and she called his name Gad. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a second son. So as you see, he's continually having sex with Leah's maid. just like he did with Rachel's maid. It says, and Leah said, happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed, and she called his name Asher. Now let's look at Jacob's father, Abraham, because we know that according to the Roman Christian Hebrews of today, Jacob is a wicked adulterer and fornicator, and he will definitely be going to the lake of fire for all of this unrepentant adultery that he's committed. According to them, according to their doctrine, he is a wicked adulterer. Okay? Yet the Bible does not say that he was rebuked for having multiple wives even once. And we're going to see what his father Abraham did. This is Genesis 16. Verse 1 says, now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. So why did Abram listen to Sarai? Why did Abraham listen to Sarah? Abraham is the head of Sarah. In Genesis 18, she called him her Lord, which is the Hebrew word Adonai. He is the head of Sarah. The man is the head of the woman, as the scriptures say. So why is he listening to her? To commit a sin, no less. For those who believe that this is a sin, because he already has a wife, and now he's about to have sex with another woman. So how wicked must Abraham be to listen to her and obey her to commit sin? That doesn't make any sense. But the fact of the matter is that the Bible doesn't say that this was a sin. So obviously to him, what she said made sense and he had no problem with it. And again, it's a part of Hebraic culture. It's only the modern westernized Hebrews who say that it's a sin. Where verse 3 says, and Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. So that's what she was. She was his wife. Who? Hagar. And then as it says in verse 4 here, he had sex with her. It says, and he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. So he had sex with Hagar, and she conceived a child. Why didn't Abraham refuse to commit this sin? Why didn't the Most High tell him that this was a sin? In fact, the child that was born, that was conceived with Hagar, was Ishmael. And Ishmael was blessed. As it says here in Genesis chapter 17, verse 20, it says, and as for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him. I'm going to read that again. And as for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him. So Ishmael, the son of Hagar and Abraham, was blessed. It says, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. So not only did the Most High not say, that's a sin, you need to be punished for this, but he said, I'm going to bless Ishmael. According to the Western Hebrews and the Western Christians who say that polygyny is a sin, not only is Jacob a wicked adulterer and fornicator who would definitely be going to the lake of fire because he never repented, according to the scriptures. He never repented of having multiple wives. So not only was Jacob wicked, but his father Abraham also was an adulterer. However, of course, the Bible doesn't say that anywhere. In fact, here in Genesis chapter 26, this is the Most High speaking. He's speaking to Isaac about Abraham. It says in verse 4, and I will make thy seed to multiply as the stars of heaven, and will give unto thy seed all these countries. and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Because that Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So that's a lot of obedience. He obeyed his voice, kept his charge, obeyed his commandments, his statutes, and his laws. That's what Abraham did. And nowhere did it say that he committed a sin by having sex with Hagar, even though he already had a wife. So in concluding this section, we can see that Abraham didn't sin and Jacob didn't sin, and these are the patriarchs of Israel. Another assertion that you will hear from those who are against men having multiple wives is they will say that this practice originated with the bloodline of Cain, with Cain's descendant named Lamech. And they are making that association in order to say that it's wicked or it's evil. So we're going to address that. Here in Genesis chapter 4, starting at verse 11, this is after Cain killed his brother Abel. And the Most High is speaking to Cain. He says, "And now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand." Verse 12 says, "When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth." And Cain said unto the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid, and I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And it shall come to pass that everyone that findeth me shall slay me." So as we see here, Cain is worried about others who he will come across killing him. Verse 15 says, "And the Lord said unto him, Therefore whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, and dwelt in the land of Nod, on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch. And he built a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch." So again, as we can see from verse 14 and 15, Cain feared that he would come across others who would kill him. This is because at this time, his relatives had already began to proliferate throughout the earth. That's also why in verse 17, you see that Cain had a wife. Where did he get his wife from? We were not told about his wife's mother and his wife's father and his wife's ancestry. Again, as I already stated, it's because Cain's relatives, the descendants of Adam and Eve, had already began to proliferate at this time. So keep that in mind. I'm going to go over that a little more here in a few minutes, but keep that in mind as we progress in this chapter. Continuing on in the same chapter, we left off at verse 17, so starting at verse 18 here. "And unto Enoch was born Irad, and Irad begat Mehuael, and Mehuael begat Methusael, and Methusael begat Lamech." Verse 19 says, "And Lamech took unto him 2 wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah. And Ada bare Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle." And verse 21 says, and his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of such as handled the harp and organ. And then verse 22 says, and Zillah, she also bare Tubal Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. And the sister of Tubal Cain was Naamah. So notice here how in verse 19 it mentions the fact that Lamech had 2 wives. And then it goes on to tell you who their sons were, the sons of these 2 women. And then it tells you details about their sons, how their sons were the originators of certain trades, of certain practices. So his wives, his 2 wives that were mentioned, are relevant to the story that's being told to you. That's why they're mentioned. Also, I want you to notice how in verse 20, it says, I'll read it again. It says, and Ada bare Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle. In other words, what it's telling you is that Jabal was the originator of dwelling in tents and having cattle, or you could say livestock. It's telling you that he was the originator of this, that this came from him. So because here in verse 20, it says that he was the father of such as dwell in tents and of such as have cattle, does that mean that it's a sin to dwell in tents and to have cattle or livestock? Because it must be a sin, because he is a descendant of Cain. He is the son of Lamech. Right? So we're using the same logic that they use about having multiple wives. Again, it just told you that he was the father, that Jabal was the father of such as dwell in tents and such as have cattle. So he's the originator of this, having livestock and dwelling in tents. That's what that means. So is that a sin? Is it a sin to dwell in tents? Is it a sin to have livestock? Of course it's not. So the logic that they're using about Lamech having multiple wives, when you're intellectually honest and you continue with the same logic, you can't just pick and choose what you want. Continue with the same logic, you would have to say that it's a sin to live in tents and to have cattle or livestock. And notice also in verse 21, it says, and his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all such as handled the harp and organ. And where it says harp here, you could say lyre, which is an instrument that was used in ancient times. So Jubal was the father of that, which means he was the originator or the pioneer of playing the lyre. So is that a sin? Is it a sin to play that instrument? That's a question. Is that a sin? Because again, he's a descendant of Cain, right? So if he did it and it's telling you that he was the originator of it, he was the father of it, then it has to be a sin. But if that doesn't have to be a sin, then it doesn't have to be a sin for Lamech to have 2 wives. Also, I want you to notice how in verse 19, it says Lamech took unto him 2 wives. But it does not say that Lamech was the father of such as had 2 wives, does it? It doesn't say that he was the father of having 2 wives or the father of having multiple wives. Even though in the next few verses it tells you that his sons were the father of certain things. So it's not telling you that he was the originator of that. Remember, Adam and Eve's descendants were already proliferating at this time. That's why Cain was able to have a wife, because there were already other people in the earth. That's why Cain was afraid that others would kill him, because there were already other people in the earth. So how can you say, honestly, that Lamech was the first person to have two wives? You can't say that. You simply cannot say that. For example, in Genesis chapter 7, it explains to you that Noah had an ark, which was a very large boat or ship. Does that mean that Noah was the first person to ever create a boat? Think about that for a second. Because here in verse 19, it says Lamech had two wives. People who hate polygyny will say that, oh, you see, it comes from the bloodline of Cain. That means it's wrong. Even though they're not saying that dwelling in tents is wrong, or having cattle, as it says in verse 20, that Jabal was the father of. And then in verse 21, it says that Jubal was the father of handling the harp, or you could say the lyre, and it says organ. They're not saying doing that's a sin. Right, so Noah in Genesis chapter 7, he built a boat. Does that mean he was the first person to ever build a boat? Absolutely not. Just because he was the first person mentioned in the Bible to build a boat does not mean that he was the first person that ever did it. And then in verses 23 and 24, it says, And Lamech said unto his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech. For I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, but truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. So his wives are relevant to the story. They're pertinent to the story that's being told here. They are the mothers of these men who were pioneers in specific trades, in playing certain instruments, etc. And he was talking to them when he made this statement that he made. That's why they're mentioned. This is Genesis 4, starting at verse 25. We left off at verse 24. And it's important to understand some things here. So it says, And Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son, and called his name Seth. For God, said she, hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. So Seth was a replacement, so to speak, for Abel. And then verse 26 says, And to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. So it says, then men began to call upon the name of the Most High. And that's because Seth was the chosen seed. He was the seed through which the chosen bloodline would come. Noah, Shem, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Christ, the prophets, they would all come through the lineage of Seth. So the reason why the story of Cain and Abel was told to us is for our learning. Nowhere does it say that Cain and Abel were Adam and Eve's first children, nor does it say that they were Adam and Eve's only children. Very important to understand. The reason why we were told that story is to teach us lessons. And then it tells us about Seth, because as I already mentioned, through Seth, would come the chosen bloodline. That's why here in Genesis chapter 5, starting at verse 1, it says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him." So it's about to give us the generations of Adam. What you're going to notice here in this chapter is that it is not going to mention Cain. What you're going to notice here in this chapter is that it is not going to mention Abel. Why? Because it's not telling you the names or accounting for the names of all of Adam and Eve's children. It's simply not doing it. What it's doing is giving you the chosen bloodline. Verse 2 says, "Male and female created he them and blessed them, and called their name Adam in the day when they were created." Verse 3 says, "And Adam lived 130 years, and begat a son in his own likeness, and after his image, and called his name Seth." So you see, Seth was after his likeness and after his image. Seth was the chosen seed. And you also notice how in verse 3 it says he lived 130 years before he even begat Seth, which means that since we know that Adam was created a grown man, and being that Eve was created likely very early on, he would have had 130 years to have children. In the span of 130 years, Adam can have multiple generations of descendants. Do the math. Again, he was created a grown man. So that's why Cain was afraid that others would kill him. Because the others were who? They were his relatives. His relatives that had began to proliferate throughout the earth. And they would hear word that Cain killed his brother Abel. They would hear that through the grapevine. And they would kill him. That's what he was afraid of. And we also know that Cain had a wife. And his wife was a descendant of Adam and Eve. That's why in Genesis chapter 3, verse 20, it tells you that Eve was the mother of all living. That means everyone descends from Eve. Just like in Tobit 8 verse 6, chapter 8 verse 6, it tells you that all mankind come from Adam and Eve. Notice how in verse 4 here it says, "And the days of Adam after he had begotten Seth were 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters." So Adam had other sons and daughters that were not mentioned by name. And then they had children, and their children had children. And they began to proliferate throughout the earth. So again, here in Genesis 5, when you read the whole chapter, it will go from Adam to Noah and his 3 sons, Japheth, Shem, and Ham. And it's giving you the chosen lineage from Adam through Seth, and then again it goes to Noah and his sons, and it is the same bloodline that you read about in Luke chapter 3 that goes from Adam to Christ, Adam to Mashiach. Why? Because that's the chosen bloodline through Seth. In fact, if you read Luke chapter 3, verses 36 through 38, it's going to give you the same bloodline that you read here in Genesis chapter 5. At the end of this chapter, Genesis chapter 5, it mentions Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But in Luke chapter 3, it's not going to mention Ham and Japheth because they're not relevant, because they are not of that chosen bloodline that Luke chapter 3 is giving you. But again, in Luke chapter 3, verses 36 through 38, you're going to read about the same bloodline that you read about here, minus Ham and Japheth. So what is the point? The point is that Adam and Eve had many descendants before Lamech was even born. Again, that's why Cain was afraid to be killed by other people, and that's why Cain was able to have a wife. So you cannot say that Lamech was the first man with multiple wives, because the Bible doesn't say that. So in this section, we're going to discuss the Esau argument. Now, this is an argument that the man in the video used, and prior to watching his video, I had never encountered this particular argument. It serves as a striking illustration of the lengths to which people would go who oppose the practice of polygyny, and how they stretch in order to attempt to support their doctrine. So although I do believe that this argument is quite absurd, it's important for us to delve into and address it. Now, here in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 16, as you see on the screen, it says, "Lest there be any fornicator or profane person as Esau, who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright." Now, the gist of the argument is that Esau was called a fornicator in this verse because he had multiple wives. Now, obviously, the verse doesn't say that at all. It actually says, "who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright." And we know that nowhere in the Bible is anyone called a fornicator for having multiple wives. But again, we have to address this. Now, we don't know everything that Esau did in his life, obviously. There are targums that speak about how wicked he was, but we are going to address this topic from a biblical standpoint or biblical perspective. And again, the argument is that Esau was called a fornicator because he took multiple wives. Now, we know that Jacob did the same thing, and he was not called a fornicator. The same thing for his father or his grandfather, Abraham, etc. So we're going to look at the scriptures to see why it may be that Esau is being called a fornicator in this verse. So again, we're addressing the fact that Esau was called a fornicator in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 16, which is a form of the Greek word pornos. Now, I already went over Jacob. I went over the fact that he had choice. He was able to make the decision to take multiple wives. He also took the servants of his two wives as his wives as well, and no one forced him to do that. But again, we've already been over that. So here in Genesis chapter 24, we're going to begin to look at why Esau may have been called a fornicator. It says in verse 1, "And Abraham was old and well stricken in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said unto his eldest servant of his house, that ruled over all that he had, Put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh, and I will make thee swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of the earth, that thou shalt not take a wife unto my son of the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell. But thou shalt go unto my country and to my kindred, and take a wife unto my son Isaac. So again, the Bible does not tell us directly why Esau was called a fornicator. So you have people with different versions of why that may be. But as you can see here, Abraham is telling his servant to take a wife for his son from Mesopotamia, instead of taking a wife of the Canaanites. In other words, take a wife from our people, which Rebecca was, a wife that is of close relation, not a wife of the Canaanites. And there's a reason why Abraham wanted that. So as we can see here, this is what Abraham wanted for his son Isaac. It's in Genesis chapter 28, starting at verse 1. It says, "And Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said unto him, Thou shalt not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan." So again, just like we saw Abraham, he wanted his son Isaac to have a wife of the kindred of Abraham rather than a wife from Canaan. Now we see Isaac saying the same thing to Jacob. Then verse 2 says, "Arise, go to Paddan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, thy mother's father, and take thee a wife from thence of the daughters of Laban, thy mother's brother." In other words, Jacob is going to take his cousin to be his wife. That's what Isaac is telling him to do, versus a Canaanite. All right, and there's a reason why Abraham and Isaac wanted their sons to take daughters that were related to them, to take women that were of Shem, rather than the women of Canaan. And that's because the women of Canaan have a different custom, have a different culture. Although in some ways it does, their culture did parallel the culture of Israel. In many ways, it was against Torah. And they also served other deities. And so it was better to not have that connection to these other nations, that family tie to these people of these other nations. And as it says in verse 3, "And God Almighty bless thee and make thee fruitful and multiply thee, that thou mayest be a multitude of people, and give thee the blessing of Abraham to thee and to thy seed with thee, that thou mayest inherit the land wherein thou art a stranger, which God gave unto Abraham." And Isaac sent away Jacob, and he went to Paddan Aram unto Laban, son of Bethuel the Syrian, the brother of Rebekah, Jacob's and Esau's mother. When Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Paddan Aram to take him a wife from thence, and that as he blessed him, he gave him a charge, saying, "Thou shalt not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan," and that Jacob obeyed his father and his mother, and was gone to Paddan Aram. And Esau, seeing that the daughters of Canaan pleased not Isaac his father, then went Esau unto Ishmael and took unto the wives which he had Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebajoth, to be his wife. In other words, as we can see here, Esau went to marry an Ishmaelite woman because he thought that that would be more pleasing to his parents. But Esau had already taken at this point wives of the daughters of Canaan. And as we already went over, Isaac didn't want that for Jacob. Abraham didn't want that for Isaac. And as it says here in verse 8, even Esau saw that the daughters of Canaan did not please his father Isaac. So again, we're seeing why Esau was called a fornicator. This is Genesis chapter 26, starting at verse 34. It says, and Esau was 40 years old when he took to wife Judith, the daughter of Beri the Hittite, and Bashemoth, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, which were a grief of mind unto Isaac and to Rebekah. So you can see here again, Abraham did not want Isaac to marry any of the daughters of Canaan, any of the heathen. Isaac did not want Jacob to marry any of the daughters of Canaan, any of the heathen. But you can see that his son Esau did what? He took the women of the foreign nations as his wives. And actually, according to Torah, these women were illegal for the children of Israel to marry. Now, obviously, at this time, the Torah had not yet been given. However, the writer of the book of Hebrews, by the time he wrote what he wrote, when he said that Esau was a fornicator, the Torah had been given. He knew the Torah very well because it was the Apostle Paul. Some people don't know that it was the Apostle Paul, but that's neither here nor there. The point is, he knew about the Torah, so he knew that it was illegal to marry these nations. But you can see that Esau is marrying these nations. So by looking at the scriptures, we can deduce why Esau, or the most likely reason why Esau was called a fornicator. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that having multiple wives is a sin. Even Jacob did it, and Jacob was not called a fornicator. However, the Bible does say that there are certain nations that the children of Israel could not take as wives. And again, looking at what Abraham wanted for Isaac, looking at what Isaac wanted for Jacob, we can see that Esau went against the desires or the will or the commandments of his parents and of his forefathers. Now, some may say, well, Esau was not an Israelite, so the laws against marrying certain nations did not apply to him. Technically, that is true. However, again, we know that Esau lost his birthright, and it was because of his behavior. It was because of how he conducted himself. Specifically, the fact that he despised his birthright, as the scriptures talk about. Now, he sold it for lentils. This is Genesis chapter 36. Verse 1 says, now these are the generations of Esau, who is Edom. Esau took his wives of the daughters of Canaan, Ada, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and Aholibama, the daughter of Anna, the daughter of Zibeon the Hivite, and Bashemoth, Ishmael's daughter, sister of Nebajoth, which we already read about. This is Deuteronomy chapter 7, starting at verse 1. It says, when the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and hath cast out many nations before thee, the Hittites, and the Girgashites, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than thou. And when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy unto them. Neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. So we can see here that the children of Israel were told not to make marriages with these 7 nations. And these nations include, as it says in verse 1, Hittites, Canaanites, and Hivites. And as we just read, Esau married women of these nations. And again, the writer of Hebrews understood that these nations were off limits because the writer of Hebrews knew the Torah. They were familiar with the Torah. The writer of Hebrews was also familiar with the fact that Abraham did not want Isaac to take any women of these nations. The writer of Hebrews was also familiar with the fact that Isaac did not want Jacob or Esau to take women of these nations. So we're seeing biblically, according to the information that we have in the scriptures, the most likely reason why Esau was called a fornicator. But we know that whatever the reason is that the writer of Hebrews called Esau a fornicator, we know that whatever the reason is, we know that it is not simply for having multiple wives. And we know that because the same writer of Hebrews that wrote in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 16, that Esau was a fornicator, just one chapter earlier, he praised polygynous men. Here in verse 32, it says, "And what shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon." So Gideon is the first name mentioned. It says, "And of Barak, and of Samson, and of Jephthah, of David also, and Samuel, and of the prophets." And what did they do? Verse 33 says, "Who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions." So we see here that the first name mentioned of these righteous men of old was Gideon. And Gideon had many wives, as we're about to read. And he also mentioned David. David also had many wives. So the writer of Hebrews should be calling these men fornicators. If Esau was called a fornicator for having multiple wives, the Most High is no respecter of persons. Gideon and David should also be called fornicators here, but they're not. They are righteous men of old who had multiple wives. So the person postulating that the reason why Paul called Esau a fornicator was because he had multiple wives, the person positing that is doing so because of their disdain for polygyny. That's why they're doing that. And to be honest with you, a lot of these men actually wish they could have multiple wives, but they know that their current wife will not allow them to do so. Here in Judges chapter 8, starting at verse 28, it says, "Thus was Midian subdued before the children of Israel, so that they lifted up their heads no more. And the country was in quietness 40 years in the days of Gideon. And Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and dwelt in his own house. And Gideon had 70 sons of his body begotten, for he had many wives." So Gideon had many wives, and we just read about he was among those who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions. Now, I know somebody is going to bring this up, so I'll mention the fact that we know that his son Abimelech went on to murder the rest of his brothers other than Jotham. So those who oppose multiple wives will say that this is an example of why having multiple wives is wrong. In other words, the reasoning goes that because Gideon had multiple wives is why his sons were murdered by their brother. However, the fact of the matter is that these murders were not because of multiple wives, but because of sin. You don't have to be a child of a polygynous union to decide that you want to murder someone. The prophet Samuel came from a polygynous family, and he was an exceptionally righteous man. So if we're blaming polygyny for people turning out badly, then we can also blame polygyny for Samuel turning out so great. One of the most righteous men in all of Scripture. Not only that, but Cain was the first murderer. So if we apply the same logic to monogamy that people are applying to polygyny, then we would have to blame monogamy for Cain murdering his brother Abel. But we're going to delve more into these arguments about how polygyny caused families to be sinful or to have problems in the next section. And in this section, we're talking about the doctrine that polygyny causes problems. The reasoning goes that in the Bible, polygyny caused problems in marriages, and or that it caused people to have sinful children. People will say things like the problems that David had with his children were because he had multiple wives. Even though we know the Bible doesn't say that, people are just making this up because they don't like men having multiple wives. So we're going to address it. So here in Genesis chapter 3, most of you know the story. I'll read a few verses. In verse 1, it says, "Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, You shall not eat of every tree of the garden. And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, You shall not eat of it, neither shall you touch it, lest ye die." And again, most of you already know the story. Now, the first sinner, as we read in this chapter, the first person to sin was Eve. All right, it also tells you that in multiple other scriptures as well. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 14 tells you that Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. And then we know that subsequently Adam sinned because of following Eve. In Ecclesiasticus chapter 25, verse 24, it says, "Of the woman came the beginning of sin, and through her we all die." So we know that Eve was the first person to sin. Now, this marriage between Adam and Eve was a monogamous marriage. So if you take the logic that people are using who hate polygyny, and you say that the polygynous marriages that had problems, you say that their problems was because of polygyny, then you have to also say that this problem is because of monogamy. Not only that, but hypothetically speaking, since we're making things up, because that's what the people who say that polygynous marriages cause sin or cause problems are doing, they're making it up. So since we're making things up, hypothetically speaking, if Eve had a sister wife, she could have intervened at this moment if Adam was not there. In other words, she could have been a good influence on Eve and told Eve not to talk to Satan. Told Eve, we shouldn't be talking to Satan. Let's do something else. She could have been a good influence on Eve instead of Eve being alone. All right, and that's a hypothetical situation. Again, I'm making that up because that's what people are doing. They're making things up. This is Genesis chapter 4, verse 8. It says, "And Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him." So the first murderer was Cain. And Cain came from a monogamous marriage. His parents were Adam and Eve. So we can see here monogamy causing a child to be a murderer. Again, if we want to use this fallacious logic that people are using, because they're saying that, hey, the reason why David's children had problems was because of polygyny. The reason why Gideon's sons were killed by their brother was because of polygyny. That's what they're doing. So you have to say that this is because of monogamy here. The first murderer was the product of a monogamous union. This is Job chapter 2, verses 7 through 10. And look at this. It says, so went Satan forth from the presence of the Lord, and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot unto his crown. And he took him a potsherd to scrape himself withal, and he sat down among the ashes. Then said his wife unto him, so Job has one wife, and this is what she's saying unto him while he's being afflicted with boils from the crown of his head to the sole of his feet. She says, dost thou still retain thine integrity? Curse God and die. Now here we see his monogamous, his one wife, telling him to curse the Most High and to die. Now again, for those who say that whenever a polygynous marriage has some problems, they blame it on the fact that the man has multiple wives, we have to blame this on him having one wife then. We have to blame it on him having one wife, and we have to say that hypothetically speaking, if Job would have had other wives, they could have been an influence on his wife so that she would not say something like that. She would have been embarrassed to say something like that in front of her sister wives because she knows that they would rebuke her. So hypothetically speaking, we could insert that here into this text. So what am I doing? I'm making up a hypothetical situation, just like the people who say that when a polygynous marriage has problems, it's because of polygyny, then we have to blame this on monogamy. For those of us who have a real understanding of the scriptures, we know that these problems, these sins, is not because of monogamy and it's not because of polygyny. It's because of sin. It's because of people's rebellion. It's because of people's flesh. This is 2 Samuel chapter 12. And again, the brother in the video said something to the effect of, he alluded to the fact that supposedly Absalom had sex with David's wives because of polygyny. He drew that connection there. He said that polygyny had something to do with that. So here in 2 Samuel chapter 12, we're going to see that David's son Absalom had sex with David's wives, and it had nothing to do with polygyny. The reason why he had sex with David's wives was a punishment from the Most High because of David committing adultery with another man's wife. In verse 10 it says, now therefore, and this is the prophet Nathan telling David what will be his punishment for having sex with Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. It says, now therefore, the sword shall never depart from thine house, because thou hast despised me, and hast taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be thy wife. Thus saith the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against thee out of thine own house, and I will take thy wives before thine eyes, and give them unto thy neighbor, and he shall lie with thy wives in the sight of the sun. For thou didst it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. So that's why Absalom had sex with David's concubines on the rooftop. It had nothing to do with the fact that David had multiple wives. In fact, in this chapter, you read about Nathan coming to David, rebuking him for having sex with another man's wife. Why didn't Nathan say, and by the way, for having sex with all those other wives you have as well? Why didn't Nathan say that? Why didn't the Most High send a prophet when David took multiple wives to rebuke him? It's because it's not a sin. This is common sense, but again, people are westernized, people are Romanized, so we have to go through all of this because people don't know what they're talking about. Now, David's son Amnon raped his sister Tamar. The brother in the video, again, I'm not quoting him, I don't want to misquote him, but he alluded to the fact that supposedly this had something to do with polygyny as well, or that it was because David had multiple wives that Amnon raped Tamar, that there was a connection there. All right, he alluded to that. So we're going to read the text here. This is 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 10 through 14. It says, and Amnon said unto Tamar, bring the meat into the chamber, that I may eat of thine hand. And Tamar took the cakes which she had made, and brought them into the chamber to Amnon her brother. And when she had brought them unto him to eat, he took hold of her, and said unto her, come lie with me, my sister. And she answered him, nay, my brother, do not force me, for no such thing ought to be done in Israel. Do not thou this folly. And I, whither shall I cause my shame to go? And as for thee, thou shalt be as one of the fools in Israel. Now therefore I pray thee, speak unto the king, for he would not withhold me from thee. Howbeit he would not hearken unto her voice, but being stronger than she, forced her and lay with her. So I believe his reasoning went that because they had different mothers, that was related to why he raped her and why polygyny is problematic. However, there's many reasons why this doesn't make sense. First of all, you don't have to be in a polygynous union to have different mothers. A man could be married to one woman, she could die, and then the man would be a widower, and then he marry another woman and have children with her, and his children from both women would be what? They would be siblings with different mothers. So you don't have to be polygynous for a man to have children that have different mothers. So that's the first mistake that he made by making that erroneous connection. People don't have to be products of polygynous marriage to rape someone. In fact, that's utterly ridiculous. Here in Genesis chapter 19, we read that Lot's daughters raped him. Was this because of monogamy? Because of the fact that Lot had one wife? Is that why they raped their father? This is Genesis chapter 19. Starting at verse 30, it says, and Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountain, and his two daughters with him, for he failed to dwell in Zoar, and he dwelt in a cave, he and his two daughters. And the firstborn said unto the younger, our father is old, and there is not a man in the earth to come in unto us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father. So as you see here, they don't have another man to have sex with, is what they're saying, which is why they want to get their father drunk and rape him, which they will proceed to do as you continue reading in this chapter. But hypothetically speaking, if he would have had another wife or other wives, he would have had more children. And if he would have had more children, it is highly likely that he would have had sons. And his daughters could have had sex with their brothers, or what some would call their half-brothers, because they have different mothers, rather than raping and having sex with Lot himself. In comparison to having sex with your father, I would say it's preferable. And also remember that in Genesis chapter 20, verse 12, Abraham said that Sarah was indeed his blood sister. The sexual laws of Leviticus 18 that outlaw sibling marriage had not yet been established at this point that we're reading about here in Genesis 19. As it says here in verse 17, it says, "And it came to pass when they had brought them forth abroad, that he said, Escape for thy life, look not behind thee, neither stay thou in all the plain, escape to the mountain, lest thou be consumed." So the angel is telling Lot, along with his family, to escape and not to look behind them. Now, skipping forward to verse 26, it says, "But his wife looked from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt." Now again, Lot had one wife. So hypothetically speaking, if Lot would have had other wives, he could have had sons. And this is an example of, hypothetically speaking, monogamy causing problems. Because once she died, what happened? His daughters felt the need to rape him so that they could procreate. All right, so we have to blame this on monogamy. Just saw an example of a rape that hypothetically could have been prevented with polygyny. This is Genesis chapter 34. It says, "And Dinah, the daughter of Leah, which she bare unto Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, prince of the country, saw her, he took her and lay with her and defiled her." So we see Shechem here raping Dinah, the daughter of Leah. Is this because of monogamy? Because we don't read that Shechem had other wives. So hypothetically speaking, again, I'm making this up because that's what people are doing who are saying that David had problems with his children because of polygyny and Gideon's children had problems because of polygyny. Here we can say that this is because of monogamy, because he wanted this one woman. Shechem raped Dinah. Had nothing to do with polygyny. So when we see Tamar being raped by her brother Amnon, we cannot blame that on polygyny. That makes no sense whatsoever. Obviously, the real cause is sin. But again, I'm making up hypothetical situations to show you that it can go both ways. Just like you can make up that polygyny caused all the problems, I can make up that monogamy caused all the problems. It's another example where we can blame monogamy for a rape if we want to. This is Genesis chapter 9, starting at verse 21. Speaking about Noah, it says, "And he drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brethren without." And when it says that he saw the nakedness of his father and told his brothers, what does that mean? That means that he had sex with his father's wife. This is Leviticus chapter 18, verse 8. It says, "The nakedness of thy father's wife thou shalt not uncover. It is thy father's nakedness." So he saw the nakedness of his father, and then he went and told his brothers. Verse 23 says, "And Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness." Again, their father's wife, which is their mother, by the way. Verse 24 says, "And Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren." And why was Canaan cursed? Because Canaan was the son of Ham and Noah's wife, Ham's mother. That's why Canaan was cursed. We could blame this on monogamy, on the fact that Noah only had one wife, and that caused his son Ham to do what he did. This makes no logical sense, but that's what people are doing with polygyny. They're making things up. They're saying David's sons and Gideon's sons were sinful because of polygyny. But we just read that the first murderer was Cain. We've just read about multiple rapes that came from what? From monogamy. So you can't blame polygyny for sin. So in this section, we are addressing the Levirate law as it applies to polygyny. As you see on the screen here in Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 and 6, and this is known again as the Levirate law. It says, if brethren dwell together, and one of them die and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry without unto a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in unto her and take her to him to wife, and perform the duty of an husband's brother unto her. And it shall be that the firstborn which she beareth shall succeed in the name of his brother which is dead, that his name be not put out of Israel. So the purpose of this law, as we just read, is so that if a man dies and he has no children, instead of his wife marrying a random man, she is to marry his brother. And this is also applied in the scriptures to other close male relatives if he has no brother. But she is to marry his brother and have a child, and that child is to continue in the name and in the legacy of the man that died, so that his name is not extinguished from Israel. Now, when it comes to the Levirate law, as you can see here, it does not specify whether or not the man or the brother who is to take on his brother's wife has wives or not. In other words, it doesn't matter if the living man who takes his brother's wife has wives or not, he is still supposed to take his brother's wife. Now, the man in the video tried to escape this point by saying that in the scriptures, men who already had a wife refused to take their brother's wife. In other words, he's trying to say that if you already have a wife, this doesn't apply to you. Now, of course, there's nowhere in the scriptures, so we're going to examine that here in this video. But before we do, I want to point this out, as it says in verse 7 through 10. And the reason why I'm pointing this part out is because the brother implied, or the brother stated, that it is not obligatory for the man to take his brother's wife. He doesn't have to do so if he doesn't want to. So as it says here in verse 7, it says, and if the man like not to take his brother's wife, then let his brother's wife go up to the gate unto the elders, and say, my husband's brother refuseth to raise up unto his brother a name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak unto him. And if he stand to it and say, I like not to take her, then shall his brother's wife come unto him in the presence of the elders, and loose his shoe from off his foot, and spit in his face, and shall answer and say, so shall it be done unto that man that will not build up his brother's house. And his name shall be called in Israel, the house of him that hath his shoe loosed. So as we can see here, there is a punishment, there is a castigation when a man does not want to cooperate with this law. It's not as if you don't have to do it if you don't want to and there's no consequences. There are consequences if you do not want to adhere to this law. Just like with the rest of the laws, there are various consequences for breaking those laws. As it says in verse 8 through 10, the elders of the city are going to speak to the man. If he's adamant that he doesn't want to take the woman as his wife, then the woman is going to loose his shoe off his foot and spit in his face. And I'm sure most of us know that being spat on, especially in the face, is one of the worst forms of disrespect that someone could receive. So she's going to spit in his face. Why? Because he's being disgraced. That's why. And then in verse 10, it even says that his name shall be called the house of him that hath his shoe loosed. In other words, he's a disgrace. He's a mockery. You will be treated with contempt. You will be ridiculed. You will have the woman spit in your face. You will be called the house of him that hath his shoe loosed. All right? So that's not something that a brother wants. Because the man in the video tried to paint the picture as if you can just refuse and there's no consequences and everything's fine and there's no problem. But that's not the case. This is Genesis chapter 38, verses 1 through 10. And I do believe that the man who made the anti-polygyny video, I do believe that he went here. So let's address it. And again, his stance is that men who already had a wife would refuse to take their brother's wife because it is not supposed to apply to them. So let's see if that's the case here. This is Genesis chapter 38, starting at verse 1. It says, "And it came to pass at that time that Judah went down from his brethren and turned in to a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. And Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. And he took her and went in unto her. And she conceived and bare a son, and he called his name And she conceived again and bare a son, and she called his name Onan. And she yet again conceived and bare a son, and called his name Shelah. And he was at Chezib when she bare him. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, whose name was Tamar. And Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slew him. And Judah said unto Onan, Go in unto thy brother's wife, and marry her, and raise up seed to thy brother." So here we see Judah is telling his son Onan that, hey, your brother is dead. The Most High killed him, as we see in verse 7. And so since your brother is dead, and since he doesn't have any children, you marry your brother's wife and raise up children for your brother. In other words, the same concept as the Levirate law. I just want to make sure that's clear. So this is the Levirate law being exercised. Of course, this is before the laws of Deuteronomy were given, but it's the same concept. It's a part of the culture. So Onan was told to do this. Notice that the scripture does not indicate whether or not Onan already had a wife. I just want to make sure that's clear. Verse 9 says, "And Onan knew that the seed should not be his, And it came to pass, when he went in unto his brother's wife, that he spilled it on the ground, lest that he should give seed to his brother. So Onan, he complied with Judah's request, and he went ahead and had sex with the wife of And as we see in verse 6, her name was Tamar. So Onan went ahead and had sex with Tamar, and he ejaculated on the ground on purpose, because as it says here in verse 9, he knew that the seed should not be his. He knew that the child would not be considered to be his child, but it would be considered to be the child of who? His brother So what we're seeing here has nothing to do with Onan already having wives and him not wanting to take another wife, or Onan already having a wife and not wanting to take another wife. It has nothing to do with that. It just told you the reason in verse 9. It's because the child would not be his. So this shows that people would refuse based on not wanting to be responsible for raising up a child in the legacy and in the name of another man. It had nothing to do with taking another wife. Again, we see that he had sex with her. He just did not want to have the child with her. So the brother that made that statement and then went to this chapter, he debunked himself. He refuted himself, because these scriptures do not corroborate in any shape or form his doctrine. This is Ruth chapter 4, starting at verse 1. And remember that the man's premise was that these examples show that when a man already had a wife, he didn't want to take another man's wife according to the Levirate law. So we're going to examine that. Here it says in verse 1, it says, Then went Boaz up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the kinsman of whom Boaz spake came by, unto whom he said, Ho, such a one, turn aside, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. So Boaz is speaking to the kinsman. The kinsman of who? The kinsman of Boaz, and the kinsman also of Elimelech, who was the husband of Naomi. All right, as it says in verse 2, And he took 10 men of the elders of the city, and said, Sit ye down here. And they sat down. And he said unto the kinsman, and when it says kinsman, that's the Hebrew word Gaal. So he said to Gaal, Naomi, that is come again out of the country of Moab, selleth a parcel of land, which was our brother Elimelech's. And I thought to advertise thee, saying, Buy it before the inhabitants and before the elders of my people. If thou wilt redeem it, redeem it. But if thou wilt not redeem it, then tell me, that I may know, for there is none to redeem it beside thee, and I am after thee. And he said, I will redeem it. So Boaz is saying, you're the next kinsman in line. All right, our brother Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, is dead, and also her sons are dead. You're the next kinsman in line. And then after you, Gaal, is me. So if you're going to buy this land from Naomi, go ahead and buy it. If not, then I'll do it. So Gaal said, I'll do it. I'll redeem the land. Now in verse 5, it says, Then said Boaz, What day thou buyest the field of the hand of Naomi, thou must buy it also of Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance. In other words, Boaz said, and by the way, Gaal, when you buy this land, this parcel of land from Naomi, you also have to take Ruth the Moabitess, because Ruth the Moabitess is the wife of Elimelech's son Mahlon, who died. And you're going to have to take her as a wife, brother, and you're going to have to raise up children or a child, I should say, with her in the name of Milan, in the name of his father, in the legacy of his father. Not in your legacy, not in your name, but in the legacy of Milan. All right, that's what Boaz is telling Gaal. And here's Gaal, or the kinsman's response. In verse 6, it says, "And the kinsman said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I mar mine own inheritance. Redeem thou my right to thyself, for I cannot redeem it." So the kinsman said, I changed my mind. I didn't know I had to do all that, brother. I prefer not to, because I don't want to mar my own inheritance. Notice that it didn't say whether or not Gaal, or the kinsman, already had a wife. It does not say that. So the brother interpolated that. He inserted that into the scriptures because he wanted that to be there, but it doesn't say that. I just want to make sure that's clear. And as it says here in verse 6, what he's saying when he says, lest I mar my own inheritance, he's saying that he already has an estate. He already has an inheritance. And so he understands that he will be expected to be responsible for Ruth, and that when Ruth has a child, this child will be continuing in the legacy of Milan, the man who died. And the estate, the property, would belong to the child and to his bloodline. Not the bloodline of Gaal, not the bloodline of the kinsman, the bloodline of the child. And so Gaal, or the kinsman, would have only a temporary possession of the property. And in the end, he would lose it altogether. So he's not interested in that. Furthermore, again, the man's argument is that Gaal is refusing because he already has a wife. Let's say that that was true. Wouldn't the fact that he's being told here to do this, although he already has a wife, mean that everyone involved understands that polygyny is lawful? I'm going to repeat that, because you have to remember, they're his kinsfolk. So in all likelihood, they know whether or not he already has a wife or other wives. They already know. Wouldn't the fact that Boaz is telling him to take Ruth the Moabitess, even though you already have another wife, wouldn't that be another indication that everyone involved, everyone who's complicit, already understands that having more than one wife is lawful according to their culture? Just think about that. So that would be yet another example showing that polygyny is biblically lawful and a part of Hebraic culture, if we wanted to take for granted what the brother was interpolating into this scripture. So again, he would be refuting himself. What you see on the screen here is a text from the Mishnah. The Mishnah is a codification of the oral law that was codified by people like Yehuda Hanasi around 200 Common Era. Now, the Mishnah contains much of what we would call halakha, and halakha refers to how we walk or how we carry out the laws in a practical fashion. So someone may have a question about how to carry out a specific law practically, and the Mishnah will go into details about that. So this gives us a good view of how many Israelites, as well as converts within the first few centuries, and even in some cases beforehand, how they thought regarding the laws of the scriptures. And as it says here, it says, in a case of four brothers, married to 4 women, and some of the brothers died childless. So they're talking about the same situation that will result in what we call a levirate marriage. So these 4 brothers, they all have wives, and it says some of them died childless. It says their wives thereby become Yevamot. So that's the name or the term for the woman whose husband dies childless. It says, if the eldest of the brothers who survived wished to consummate the levirate marriage with all of his Yevamot, he has permission to do so. So as we can see, according to the ancients who wrote the Mishnah, they agree with what I've been saying. The fact that a man, even if he already had a wife, would still take on the wife of his dead brother, according to what we read in Torah. Remember, there's no stipulation in Torah for whether or not he already had a wife. It doesn't matter. He still has to marry his dead brother's wife. And notice here, it not only says that he is to marry one of his dead brother's wives, but it says that if the eldest of the brothers who survived wish to consummate the levirate marriage with all of his Yevamot, that's plural. That means multiple brothers of his have died, and there are multiple women. Remember, he already has a wife, but there are multiple other women that he can take as his wife because of the levirate law. It says that he can take all of them as his wives. And this is also relevant for those who say that during the times of the New Testament, polygyny was not being practiced. But again, the Mishnah was codified around 200 AD. So those who lived within Hebrew and Israelite culture still understood that polygyny was lawful. In this section, we're going to be discussing the topic of David being given the former wives of King Saul. So here we are in 2 Samuel chapter 12. In verse 1 it says, And the Lord sent Nathan unto David, and he came unto him and said unto him, There were 2 men in one city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had exceeding many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing saving 1 little ewe lamb, which he had bought and nourished up, and it grew up together with him and with his children. It did eat of his own meat and drank of his own cup, and lay in his bosom, and was unto him as a daughter. And there came a traveler unto the rich man, and he spared to take of his own flock and of his own herd, to dress for the wayfaring man that was come unto him, but took the poor man's lamb, and dressed it for the man that was come to him. And David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. And he said to Nathan, As the Lord liveth, the man that hath done this thing shall surely die. And he shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity. And Nathan said to David, Thou art the man. Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I anointed thee king over Israel, and I delivered thee out of the hand of Saul. So this parable that Nathan is telling to David is really about David committing adultery with another man's wife, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Continuing on, it says in verse 8, And I gave thee thy master's house, talking about Saul, and thy master's wives into thy bosom, speaking about the former wives or women of Saul. And then it says, And gave thee the house of Israel and of Judah. And if that had been too little, I would moreover have given unto thee such and such things. Wherefore hast thou despised the commandment of the Lord to do evil in his sight? Thou hast killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and hast taken his wife to be thy wife. and hast slain him with the sword of the children of Ammon. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from thine house, because thou hast despised me, and hast taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be thy wife. So as we can see, Nathan is explaining to David's punishment for committing adultery with the wife of Uriah the Hittite, committing adultery with his wife and killing him. Now, the question is, why isn't Nathan rebuking David for having multiple wives? Why did he wait until David took another man's wife and rebuked him for that? Why isn't Nathan saying, and you're being punished also for taking all of these other wives? It's because it's not a sin, that's why. But if you say that having multiple wives is a sin, why is it that everything was fine until David took another man's wife and then Nathan was sent to correct David? Why wasn't Nathan sent to correct David when David had already previously taken multiple wives? Again, this is 2 Samuel chapter 12. When we go to chapter 3, it says in verse 1, Now there was long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, but David waxed stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul waxed weaker and weaker. And unto David were sons born in Hebron, and his firstborn was Amnon of Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and his second Chileab of Abigail, the wife of Nabal the Carmelite, and the third Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur, and the fourth Adoniah, the son of Haggith, and the fifth Shephatiah, the son of Abital, and the sixth Ithream by Eglah, David's wife. These were born to David in Hebron. So we can see here that there are 6 wives of David being mentioned. And this is before the events that we just read about in 2 Samuel chapter 12. This is before David had sex with Bathsheba. So we can see that David had 6 wives here already. And if you count Milcah, that's 7. So why isn't he being rebuked by Nathan when he took all of these women to be his wife? That's a question you have to answer if you want to claim that polygyny is a sin. Also in chapter 5, starting at verse 10, it says, And David went on and grew great, and the Lord God of hosts was with him. And Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, and cedar trees, and carpenters, and masons. And they built David an house. And David perceived that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for his people Israel's sake. So as you can see, as it says in verse 10, David waxed great, and the Most High was with him. It says in verse 12 that he perceived that the Most High had established him king over Israel and exalted his kingdom. And then in verse 13, it says what? It says, And David took him more concubines and wives out of Jerusalem after he was come from Hebron, and there were yet sons and daughters born to David. So again, this is before David committed adultery with Bathsheba. David had multiple wives. So why isn't Nathan rebuking him for that? Nathan is only rebuking him for the sin of adultery and the murder, of course, of Uriah the Hittite. And I'm going to read from verse 11. I'm going to read from 11 to 14 here. It says, Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will raise up evil against thee out of thine own house, and I will take thy wives before thine eyes, and give them unto thy neighbor, and he shall lie with thy wives in the sight of the sun. For thou didst this secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel, and before the sun. And David said unto Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said unto David, The Lord also hath put away thy sin, thou shalt not die. Verse 14 says, Howbeit, because by this deed thou hast given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the child also that is born unto thee shall surely die. So the child that David had with Bathsheba originally, that child died. Why didn't David's other children all die? Remember, we just read that he had 6 wives, 7 if you count Milcah. And we just read in chapter 5 that he took wives and concubines. So why didn't all of his children die? According to the people who are anti-polygyny, all of this is fornication or adultery. So why aren't all the children being put to death? 1 Kings chapter 15, starting at verse 1, it says, Now in the 18th year of King Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, reigned Abiam over Judah. 3 years reigned he in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom. And he walked in all the sins of his father, which he had done before him. And his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father. So as you see, the heart of David was perfect with the Most High. Verse 4 says, Nevertheless, for David's sake did the Lord his God give him a lamp in Jerusalem, to set up his son after him and to establish Jerusalem. Then verse 5 says, Because David did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, and turned not aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, save only in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. So as we can see right here, it says in verse 5 that David did what was right in the eyes of the Most High, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. And that's when he committed adultery with Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, and had Uriah murdered. So there was no problem with him having all those multiple wives. Nowhere in the Bible did it say that it was a problem when he had multiple wives. We know that David was rebuked for this. He was also rebuked for counting Israel. But again, the Most High never had an issue with David for taking multiple wives. We're going to focus on these verses here, 7 through 9 of 2 Samuel chapter 12. It says, I'll read it again. And Nathan said to David, Thou art the man. Thus saith the Lord God of Israel. I anointed thee king over Israel, and I delivered thee out of the hand of Saul. And I gave thee thy master's house and thy master's wives into thy bosom. And remember, this is after Saul had died. Keep that in mind. And it says, and gave thee the house of Israel and of Judah. And if that had been too little, I would moreover have given unto thee such and such things. So if what I gave you wasn't enough, I would have given you more. That's what the Most High is saying. Essentially what he's saying is, why would you commit adultery with another man's wife when you have all of this? And we're going to go into more details in a minute here. And verse 9 says, Wherefore hast thou despised the commandment of the Lord to do evil in his sight? Thou hast killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and hast taken his wife to be thy wife, and hast slain him with the sword of the children of Ammon. So again, why would you do that when I've already given you all of these things and would have given you more? Now, when it says, and thy master's wives, talking about Saul, for those who don't know, that's who it's talking about. Saul had 2 wives that were recorded in the scriptures named Ahinoam, and he also had a wife or a concubine named Rizpah. But we do not know exactly how many wives he had, because there could have been wives that were not named that Saul had. We also don't know if one of these 2 women that I just mentioned were the mother of his daughter Michal. And the reason why that's relevant is because if David would have taken the mother of his daughter Michal to be his wife, that would be sin, that would be unlawful, according to the sexual laws of Leviticus. But again, as I just said, we don't know if one of these two women were the mother of Michal or not. For all we know, Michal's mother could have died, or Saul could have divorced her, etc. So we don't know that. So a person cannot use the argument that because Saul only had two wives mentioned, that therefore one of them had to be Michal's mother, and therefore the Most High is not saying that Saul's wives were given to David. That argument is null and void because of what I just explained. We don't know if Saul had other wives, and we also don't know if Rizpah, which is Saul's concubine, or Ahinoam, which is Saul's other wife, we don't know if either one of them was Michal's mother or not, because the Bible doesn't say that. So if that was a little complicated for you, rewind that and listen to it again. Now, what we do know is that kings would generally, especially in those days, have a harem of women, and that their successor would often inherit that harem. Also, we have to remember that in the Hebrew, this word that's translated here as wives, where it says in verse 8, thy master's wives, this word does not necessarily mean wife. What it means is women, and it can also mean wives. So let's look at the exact phrase here in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 8. Here we are in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 8, where it says, and I gave thee thy master's house and thy master's wives. Now, when it says master's wives here, it says, and thy master's wives in English. What does it say here in the Hebrew? Adoneka ve'et nishe. Adoneka ve'et nishe. That's your master's wives. Ve'et nishe is what's being translated as wives. And nishe, which is this part here, is a form of the Hebrew word isha, which again means women. Nishe, that means women. Remember also that we already read in 2 Samuel chapter 3 that David already had multiple wives at this time. We also read it here in 2 Samuel chapter 5. And you have to remember that all of this is after Saul died. Saul died in 1 Samuel chapter 31. So Saul is already dead when all of this is happening. So the point is, they could have been former concubines, wives, or close relatives of King Saul. Because again, we have to remember that when it says, and I gave thee thy master's wives into thy bosom, the Hebrew term is ve'et nishe, which means your master's women. That's why the text does not say that I gave you your master's men and women. It only specifically says women because that's relevant to the rebuke that David is receiving from Nathan the prophet. Again, the reason why it doesn't say, I gave you your master's men and women into thy bosom, but it specifically says women, is because that's relevant to what Nathan is explaining to David. You committed adultery, although you had all of these women available to you. That's the point of him mentioning the women that were put into David's bosom. That's why it doesn't say men and women. It specifies only women. And then it talks about the house of Israel and the house of Judah, etc. But the reason why it doesn't say men and women is because this is relevant to the context. David was given all of these things. He was given multiple women, access to many women of Saul, Saul's house, Israel and Judah. And the Most High would have given him more if that wasn't enough. But instead, David chose to commit adultery with another man's wife. That's the point. Now, remember that in 2 Samuel chapter 12, which we already read, it explained that a part of David's punishment for committing adultery was that his neighbor would have sex with his wives. And that referred to his 10 concubines that his son Absalom had sex with. Now, we already read in 2 Samuel chapter 3 that David had 6 wives, and it would be 8 in total that were mentioned in the scriptures by name, and that 8 would be the 6 that are mentioned in 2 Samuel chapter 3, plus Bathsheba, plus Michal. So that would be 8 in total. Now again, the 10 concubines are separate. So that would be 18 in total. Assuming, of course, that none of the women that were mentioned in 2 Samuel chapter 6 were any of these 10 concubines, which they don't appear to have been. The only caveat will be in 1 Kings chapter 1, where it mentions the virgin woman who kept David warm in the bed when he was an elderly man and could not keep warm. But here in 2 Samuel chapter 20, it mentions the 10 concubines. I'll just read verse 3 for brevity's sake. It says, "And David came to his house at Jerusalem, and the king took the 10 women, his concubines, whom he had left to keep the house, and put them in ward, and fed them, but went not in unto them. So they were shut up unto the day of their death, living in widowhood." And these are the 10 concubines that his son Absalom had sex with. Some of these women could have been former wives or concubines or close relatives of King Saul. Because as we read in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 8, David was giving the wives or the women of King Saul. Here in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 8, I told you that the word for wives in the Hebrew is the word nishe. Nishe. And we're going to see, and it's a form of the word isha. We're going to see a form of the same word being used here. This is Jeremiah chapter 38. In verse 22, it says, "And behold, all the women that are left in the king of Judah's house." So we're saying that this is referring to women of the king of Judah's house. It says, "Shall be brought forth to the king of Babylon's princes, and those women shall say, Thy friends have set thee on, and have prevailed against thee. Thy feet are sunk in the mire, and they are turned away back. So they shall bring out all thy wives and thy children to the Chaldeans." So this is talking about all your wives, all your children, just like all the women of the king of Judah's house. And when it says wives here, that's the Hebrew word nashecha, which is to say it is a form of the same word. And it's being used as wives here. Your wives and your children, or your women and children, they're going to be delivered to the Chaldeans. So the point that the Most High is making in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 8, is that David had the whole kingdom of Israel and Judah, including any of these women of Saul, at his disposal. And that he would have given David more if it had been necessary. Yet and still, David decided to sleep with another man's wife. The sin was sleeping with another man's wife, not having multiple wives. Modern Western Christian scholars who don't even support polygyny will even tell you this in their commentaries. So this is not something that Hebrew men are making up because of their so-called lust. Again, the Roman Christian so-called biblical scholars will even tell you that the successor to the king's throne would inherit his harem of women, and that's what verse 8 of 2 Samuel chapter 12 was referring to. And they don't even believe in polygyny. Again, they're Western Roman Christian scholars in many cases. They're just objectively exegeting the text. But I think this is interesting. This is 2 Samuel chapter 12. This is the Peshitta, which is the Aramaic Bible. It says in verse 8, it says, "And I gave you the daughters of your master." So this is speaking to David again, saying, "I gave you the daughters of Saul." It says, "And the wives of your master, it says, "And the wives of your master I made to lie in your bosom. And I gave you the daughters of Israel and Yehudah. But if you had said they were few, I would have added to you such as these and such as these." In other words, again, it's relevant to the context. Why did you commit adultery, David, when you had multiple women available to you? So why would you commit adultery with another man's wife? Again, that's why it didn't mention your master's men. It specifically says your master's women. The Most High is the one who permitted David to have multiple women, multiple wives. So in this section, we're going to address Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17, which the man who made the anti-polygyny video did use. And he used the scripture as if it applied to all men in general. And it wasn't until towards the end of his video that he surreptitiously snuck in the fact that it was referring to kings. But the majority of the time when he was speaking about it, he used it as if it was speaking to all men. So he used it out of context. But we're going to read it here and we're going to see the proper context and we're going to see what this is talking about. So this is Deuteronomy chapter 17, starting at verse 14. It says, "When thou art come into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, and shall possess it, and shall dwell therein, and shall say, I will set a king over me, like as all the nations that are about me, thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose, one from among thy brethren shalt thou set king over thee. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee, which is not thy brother." So the Most High is saying that the Israelites, when they establish someone to be their king, he has to be an Israelite man. He can't be a man of another nation. Verse 16 says, "But he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt, to the end that he should multiply horses. For as much as the Lord has said unto you, you shall henceforth return no more that way." Verse 17 says, "Neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away. Neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold." So as you can see in verse 17, it says that the king shall not multiply wives to himself. What is it talking about? He's saying is that he shall not overindulge in the acquisition of wives. That's what the Most High is saying. It does not mean that the king can only have one wife. As we see in verse 16, he said he shall not multiply horses to himself. Does that mean that the king can only have one horse? Absolutely not. It means that the king should not overindulge in the acquisition of horses. Because if the king wanted to be greedy, he could take virtually all the horses of the kingdom for himself. And so the same applies with the women in verse 17, or the wives. If the king wanted to be greedy, the king could take virtually all of the women of the kingdom to himself. He could take an exorbitant amount of wives. So the Most High is saying that the king should not overindulge. And it even explains further. It says that his heart turn not away. That's the reason for it. Because these women are going to turn his heart away from the Most High. And we're going to read about that in a moment here. It also said that he should not greatly multiply silver or gold. Obviously, that doesn't mean that the king can only have one silver or one gold. If the king wanted to, he could take virtually all of the money in the kingdom for himself. That's the point of what the Most High is saying here. And again, I want to reiterate the fact that in verse 17, it says that he shall not multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away. So that's the reason for it. Not because it's fornication, which is the Hebrew word zanah in its various forms. Not because it's zanah, but that his heart turn not away. Heart turn not away from what? From the Most High. This is 1 Kings chapter 11, and this is speaking about King Solomon. And he is an example of overindulging, of multiplying wives, and having those wives turn your heart away from the Most High. Verse 1 says, "But King Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and Hittites, of the nations concerning which the Lord said unto the children of Israel, you shall not go into them, neither shall they come in unto you. For surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clave unto these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart." So just like the Most High said, he said that they turn not away your heart. That's what it said in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17. It said, don't multiply wives so that they don't turn away your heart. And that's exactly what happened to King Solomon. So we can see that the Most High always knows what he's talking about. And then in verse 4, it says, "For it came to pass when Solomon was old that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father." Now this is interesting because David, his father, also had multiple wives. In a previous section, we've already discussed the fact that David had 18 wives. But it says that David's heart was perfect with the Most High, but Solomon's wasn't. So we can see that having multiple wives in and of itself is not the sin or not the problem. But what Solomon did is he married strange women, women of some of the nations that are forbidden for the Israelites to marry. Also multiplied wives. He overindulged. He had an exorbitant amount of wives. But again, here in verse 4, it says David, his father, his heart was perfect with the Most High. And David was a polygynous man. And David was never told that he was sinning for having multiple wives. Still in the same chapter, in verse 7, it says, "Then did Solomon build an high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, in the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon, And likewise did he for all his strange wives, which burnt incense and sacrificed unto their gods. And the Lord was angry with Solomon, because his heart was turned away from the Lord God of Israel, which had appeared unto him twice. So as it says in verse 9, it says the Most High was angry with Solomon, and then it says because he had multiple wives. No, it doesn't say that at all, does it? It says because his heart was turned from the Lord God of Israel. That was the problem. There was a reason, because his heart was turned away from the Lord God of Israel. And that's exactly the same reason that Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17 gave you for the reason why the king should not multiply wives. It says, neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away. Okay, it gave you the reason for it. It's not because having more than one wife is a sin. It's because they can turn his heart away from the Most High. That's the reason for it. And I've already explained that it doesn't mean that he can only have one wife. It means that he should not have an inordinate amount of wives. But we know that Solomon did have an inordinate amount of wives. So we know that Solomon broke that law and he suffered the consequence. The Most High knew what he was talking about when he said that they will turn your heart away. We already read earlier in this chapter that David's heart was perfect with the Most High, even though he had multiple wives. This is 1 Kings chapter 15, starting at verse 1. It says, now in the 18th year of King Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, reigned Abiam over Judah. 3 years reigned he in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom. And he walked in all the sins of his father, which he had done before him. And his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father. That's another witness telling you that David's heart was perfect with the Most High. This polygynous man, this man who had 18 wives in total. Verse 4 says, nevertheless, for David's sake did the Lord his God give him a lamp in Jerusalem, to set up his son after him, and to establish Jerusalem. So he did it for David's sake. He did it for the polygynous man's sake. Verse 5 says, because David did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, and turned not aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, save only in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. So we can see that David was a righteous man. It says save only in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. That's because David committed adultery with another man's wife. And we've already been over that in our earlier section. 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 10 says, and David went on and grew great, and the Lord God of hosts was with him. So the Most High was with David. David is living righteously. Verse 11 says, and Hiram king of Tyre sent messengers to David, and cedar trees, and carpenters, and masons, and they built David an house. And David perceived that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for his people Israel's sake. So David is walking in the way of the Most High. The Most High established him king. Verse 10 says, the Most High was with him. Verse 13 says, and David took him more concubines and wives out of Jerusalem, after he was come from Hebron, and there were yet sons and daughters born to David. David's taking multiple wives and concubines while being righteous. This righteous man, David. That's why Christ is called the Son of David. Why was he never told that it was a sin? Why wasn't he ever told to stop that? Stop all of that. Why wasn't all this fornication being mentioned? Why was the Most High ignoring all of this fornication? So this is another king, King Joash. We're going to read about him. This is 2 Kings chapter 11. It says, and when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the seed royal. But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Joram, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him from among the king's sons which were slain. And they hid him, even him and his nurse, in the bedchamber from Athaliah, so that he was not slain. So Athaliah, who is the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, had all the rightful male heirs to the throne killed so that she could rule. Verse 3 says, and he was with her hid in the house of the Lord 6 years, and Athaliah did reign over the land. Verse 4 says, and the 7th year Jehoiada sent and fetched the rulers over hundreds, and Jehoiada is the priest, a righteous priest. He is the husband of Jehosheba, the woman who hid young King Joash when he was a baby. It says in the 7th year, and when it says the 7th year, this is the 7th year of Joash's life. Jehoiada sent and fetched the rulers over hundreds with the captains and the guard, and brought them to him in the house of the Lord, and made a covenant with them, and took an oath of them in the house of the Lord, and showed them the king's son. And he commanded them, saying, this is the thing that you shall do. A third part of you that enter in on the Sabbath shall even be keepers of the watch of the king's house. And a third part shall be at the gate of Shur, and a third part at the gate behind the guard. So shall you keep the watch of the house, that it be not broken down. And 2 parts of all you that go forth on the Sabbath, even they will keep the watch of the house of the Lord about the king. In other words, Jehoiada is directing everyone so that they can protect King Joash. And they're about to make an announcement that they're going to make him king instead of Athaliah. Athaliah is not supposed to be ruling the land. Okay, the Bible never said set a queen over you. He said set a king over thee. And she's doing nothing but following in the footsteps of her mother Jezebel. But verse 8 says, and you shall compass the king round about, every man with his weapons in his hand, and he that cometh within the ranges, let him be slain. And be ye with the king as he goeth out and as he cometh in. And the captains over the hundreds did according to all things that Jehoiada the priest commanded. And they took every man his men that were to come in on the Sabbath, with them that should go out on the Sabbath, and came to Jehoiada the priest. And to the captains over hundreds did the priest give King David spears and shields that were in the temple of the Lord. And the guard stood, every man with his weapons in his hand, round about the king, from the right corner of the temple to the left corner of the temple, along by the altar in the temple. And he brought forth the king's son, and put the crown upon him, and gave him the testimony. And they made him king, and anointed him, and they clapped their hands, and said, God save the king. When they say the king's son, is talking about King Ahaziah that was killed by King Jehu. And Joash is the son of Ahaziah. And verse 13 says that when Athaliah heard the noise of the guard and of the people, she came to the people into the temple of the Lord. And when she looked, behold, the king stood by a pillar, as the manner was, and the princes and the trumpeters by the king. And all the people of the land rejoiced and blew with trumpets. And Athaliah rent her clothes and cried, treason, treason. But Jehoiada the priest commanded the captains of the hundreds, the officers of the host, and said unto them, have her forth without the ranges, and him that followeth her kill with the sword. For the priest has said, let her not be slain in the house of the Lord. And they laid hands on her, and she went by the way by the which the horses came into the king's house, and there was she slain. And Jehoiada made a covenant between the Lord and the king and the people, that they should be the Lord's people, between the king also and the people. So this is a righteous priest doing righteous acts, establishing King Joash as king, and making a covenant between the Most High and his people and the king, that they're going to serve the Most High. So I'm reading this so that you can have some context about King Joash and about the priest Jehoiada. Jehoiada was the mentor of Joash. Verse 18 says, and all the people of the land went into the house of Baal and broke it down. His altars and his images brake they in the pieces thoroughly, and slew Matan, the priest of Baal, before the altars. And the priests appointed officers over the house of the Lord. And he took the rulers over hundreds, and the captains, and the guard, and all the people of the land. And they brought down the king from the house of the Lord, and came by the way of the gate of the guard to the king's house. And he sat on the throne of the kings. And all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was in quiet. And they slew Athaliah with the sword beside the king's house. 7 years old was Joash when he began to reign. So now he's 7 years old. They hid him for 7 years, and now he's beginning his reign. You have some background on the story of King Joash and the priest Jehoiada. This is 2 Chronicles chapter 24, starting at verse 1. It says Joash was 7 years old when he began to reign, and we already read that, so we already know that. It says, and he reigned 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name also was Zibiah of Beersheba. Verse 2 says, and Joash did that which was right in the sight of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest. So I want to make sure you understand that. I'm going to read it again. Joash did that which was right in the sight of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest. Okay? Verse 3 says, and Jehoiada took for him 2 wives, and he begat sons and daughters. So while Jehoiada the priest was alive and mentoring Joash, Joash did what was right. That's what we just read in verse 2. And during this time, he had 2 wives that Jehoiada the priest gave him. I just want to make sure that's clear. What are we reading? We're reading the Bible. Verse 4 says, and it came to pass after this that Joash was minded to repair the house of the Lord. So he even dedicated himself to repairing the house of the Most High. He even ventured to repair the house of the Most High. So Jehoiada was righteous, and Joash was righteous during this time while Jehoiada was alive. And he had 2 wives. We're still in the same chapter. This is verse 15 and 16, speaking about Jehoiada the priest. It says, but Jehoiada waxed old and was full of days when he died. 130 years old was he when he died. And they buried him in the city of David among the kings, because he had done good in Israel, both toward God and toward his house. I'm going to read that part again. It says, because he had done good in Israel, both toward God and toward his house. And we already read about much of the good that Jehoiada the priest did. And we already read that Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Most High while Jehoiada was alive, because Jehoiada was a righteous mentor to him. And his righteous mentor gave him 2 wives. This is 1 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 33. It says, and these are they that waited with their children. Of the sons of the Kohathites, Heman a singer, the son of Joel, the son of Shemuel. And when it says Shemuel, that's talking about Samuel, the prophet Samuel, the one who the book of Samuel is named after. All right, for those who don't know. It says the son of Elkanah. Samuel's father was Elkanah. His mother was Hannah. It says the son of Jeroham, the son of Eliel, the son of Toah. So what's the point? The point is that they are Kohathites. They are Levites. Shemuel was a Levite. And so was his father Elkanah. Now, most of us already know that the children of Israel are a set-apart people, according to the scriptures. But the Levites are even set apart from the rest of the children of Israel. So the children of Israel are set apart, but the Levites are set apart even from the rest of the children of Israel. So we're reading about the same Levite here, Elkanah. Here in verse 1 of 1 Samuel chapter 1, it says, "Now there was a certain man of Ramothaim Zophim of Mount Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. And he had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. And this man went up out of his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice unto the Lord of hosts in Shiloh." So he's doing what he's supposed to do. He's walking in righteousness. He's a set apart Levite walking in Torah, coming up yearly to worship and to do his sacrifices. And he just said in verse 2 that he had 2 wives. And then it goes on to say, "And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priests of the Lord, were there." So yearly he came up to sacrifice and to worship before the Most High. The priests were there. How come nobody ever rebuked him? Why didn't the priest say, "Hey brother, the Most High said you need to stop this fornication that you're doing. He's not accepting your worship. He's not accepting your sacrifice. You've got 2 wives, brother. That's fornication. You need to stop that." Why didn't that ever happen? And again, his wife Hannah was the mother of the great prophet Samuel. Now here in verse 11, it says, "And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thine handmaid, and remember me, and not forget thine handmaid, but will give unto thine handmaid a man child, then I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head." Verse 12 says, "And it came to pass as she continued praying before the Lord, that Eli marked her mouth. Now Hannah, she spake in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she had been drunken. And Eli said unto her, How long wilt thou be drunken? Put away thy wine from thee. And Hannah answered and said, No, my Lord, I am a woman of a sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. Count not thine handmaid for a daughter of Belial, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief have I spoken hitherto. Then Eli answered and said, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant thee thy petition that thou hast asked of him. So the Most High is going to bless Hannah to have a child, to have the son that she's asking the Most High to give her in verse 11. And Eli also told her that the Most High is going to give you what you're asking for, grant you your petition. Why did the Most High say you need to repent and stop that fornication that you're doing? Why didn't the priest Eli say, instead of telling her the Most High is going to grant you your petition, why didn't Eli say, Sister, the Most High is punishing you for fornication because you're in a polygynous marriage? Or the Most High is punishing your husband for fornication because he has 2 wives. That's why the Most High won't give you a son, sister, because your husband has 2 wives. Why didn't Eli say that? She made a vow to the Most High, and her requests were granted. And we know that this chapter speaks about the fact that she had issues with her sister wife, Peninnah, because I know that the polygyny haters, they would love to bring that up. But as we know, when dealing with human beings, there's always a potential for some sort of issues. And we know that no marriage is perfect, whether it be monogamous, whether it be polygynous. In an earlier section, I've already been over the many problems that monogamous marriages have had. So you're going to have problems either way. And just like there's a potential for there to be problems between co-wives, there's also a potential for a camaraderie or a sisterhood. Right? So just like with anything else, it has its pros and its cons. This should be common sense, but because we live in a westernized society, polygyny is looked at as an aberration. When in actuality, throughout the world and throughout world history, there have been more societies that accepted polygyny as normal than there have been societies that demand that everyone be monogamous. That's just a fact. So monogamy as a rule, forced monogamy, socially imposed forced monogamy as a rule is the exception, is the aberration, is the abnormality, not polygyny. And here are some notes on estate planning. Now, there's no fixed answer for every situation because details change depending on the laws, where you live geographically, and also depending on what plans or desires you have for your family, etc. But here are just some general guidelines or notes regarding estate planning. So obviously you want to create an inventory. You want to list all of your assets, whether it be real estate, financial accounts, investments, property, etc. And you also want to clarify your goals, your objectives, taking into account, the financial needs and circumstances of your family. You're going to want to seek assistance from professionals such as estate planning attorneys, financial advisors, etc. You're going to want to speak to legal counsel who are familiar with the laws where you live. And you also want to become more familiar with the laws yourself. And what you're going to do is you're going to create a revocable living trust, which can hold your assets during your lifetime and facilitate a smooth transfer of your assets and allow you to avoid probate when it comes time to transfer your assets to your loved ones. Now, you may also consider irrevocable trusts, which are more concrete and more permanent and offer more protection from anyone that might want to have the trust changed or altered. And again, these are just general guidelines. Every situation is different. Now, obviously, you're going to appoint some trustees when you set up this trust. You're going to appoint a trustee and possibly successor trustees who can manage the trust and distribute your assets according to your instructions. You also want to create a will that complements the trust. And what the will is going to do is specify your wishes regarding your personal property or any assets that you want to leave to any specific wives or family members. And if you have specific items or amounts that you want to leave to each wife or family member, you're going to outline them as bequests in your will or as gifts in your trust. You also might want to consider life insurance policies. And you're also going to want to establish a durable power of attorney. Now, this can be a healthcare power of attorney, which is to say, in the situation where the man may become incapacitated, he has already designated someone, maybe one of his wives, to be responsible for health-related decisions in the event that he cannot make those decisions for himself. And he may also want to appoint a financial power of attorney, which is someone, again, it could be one of his wives, it can be someone else, but this is someone who will make the financial and legal decisions on his behalf. And this will create more clarity on what the family is to do in the event that the man cannot make these decisions for himself because maybe he has become incapacitated. And again, this is not a one-size-fits-all because laws vary depending on what country you live in, depending on what state you live in, etc. But these are some general guidelines. And for those who may have a 401k, you may choose to have several primary beneficiaries to your 401k and allocate percentages of your assets to your beneficiaries. Shalom.